Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to unpack a truly fascinating and sometimes controversial dynamic that sits right at the heart of our society. We're going to break down exactly how social differences, specifically gender, religion, and caste, express themselves in democratic politics. We often hear that mixing identity in politics is just a recipe for absolute disaster. But as we're going to see by looking at the data today, these social divisions actually act like a double-edged sword. On one hand, they can be incredibly powerful tools for equality, literally giving a voice to the voiceless. But on the other hand, they can absolutely become weapons of division. It's a super delicate balance, and understanding it is absolutely crucial to understanding how modern democracy actually works. Okay, let's map out our roadmap really quick. We've got 5 main areas to cover today. First, diversity and democracy. Second, gender, the invisible divide. Third, religion, where we'll look at communalism versus secularism. Fourth, caste, hierarchy, and politics. And finally, Section 5, how all of this comes together as a double-edged sword.
All right, Section 1, diversity in democracy. To kick things off, we really need to tackle a fundamental assumption about democracies and the wildly diverse groups of people living inside them.
Now, you might be wondering, does bringing all these different identities, different genders, religions, or castes into the political arena threaten to just tear a nation apart? It's a totally natural question to ask, right? If politics is supposed to unite us, isn't focusing on our differences completely counterproductive? Well, the answer, which actually surprises a lot of people, is no. The existence of social diversity does not inherently threaten democracy. In fact, bringing these differences into the political spotlight is not just possible, it's often really desirable and super healthy for a democratic system. The big takeaway here is that disadvantaged groups actually benefit when their unequal treatment is brought up in the political domain. Because think about it, if they don't have a platform to express their unique challenges, well, those challenges simply get ignored.
Moving right along to Section 2, gender, the invisible divide. This is a division we see absolutely everywhere, all across the globe, yet it is rarely recognized in traditional studies of politics.
And why is that? Mostly because the gender divide tends to be mistakenly viewed as this natural, unchangeable, biological reality. But actually, scratch that, it isn't. It is fundamentally built on societal expectations and stereotypes. Just think about how we spend our time. Looking at the Daily Time Use Survey gives us a brilliant picture of the sexual division of labor. When you break it down, an average woman is actually working a little over 7.5 hours every single day, compared to an average man who works about 6.5 hours. But here is the massive catch. The bulk of women's work is in household and related tasks. It's unpaid, it's domestic, and therefore it's almost entirely invisible to the broader economy. Because men's work is mostly income generating, it gets seen and valued, leaving women's massive, everyday contributions to society largely unrecognized. Because ours is still largely a patriarchal society, which literally translates to rule by father, a system that fundamentally values men more and gives them power over women, women's labor continues to go largely unvalued. This systemic imbalance is exactly why feminist movements sparked all over the world. These are powerful movements driven by people who believe in equal rights and opportunities, demanding equality not just in the political sphere, but right down to personal and family life as well.
So, because women's roles were historically pushed into the private sphere of the home, their presence in public life and politics has been incredibly minimal. In India, for example, female representation in the Lok Sabha hit just 14.36% in 2019. To put that into perspective, the global average is around 24%, and regions like the Nordic countries are sitting well over 40%. This stark underrepresentation really hits the nail on the head as to why feminists argue that unless women actively hold political power, their specific, everyday problems just will not get adequate attention. Which brings us to a massive, concrete political solution. After decades of women's organizations demanding a seat at the table, we saw the passing of the 2023 Women's Reservation Act. This is a real game changer. It legally binds 33% of seats in the Lok Sabha and state assemblies specifically for women. It's a textbook example of our earlier point. Sometimes direct political action and government intervention are exactly what's required to fix these deep-rooted social divisions.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, religion, communalism versus secularism. Now, unlike gender, which is pretty much a universal divide, religious diversity varies a lot. And crucially, religious differences are very frequently expressed in highly exclusive partisan ways in politics. To really grasp the scale here, consider the religious breakdown from the 2011 Census of India.
You've got a Hindu majority at just under 80%, a large Muslim minority at 14.2%, alongside Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, and several others. Now, historical figures like Mahatma Gandhi actually believed religion could never truly be separated from politics. But, to be clear, he didn't mean pushing one specific religion. He meant that politics should be guided by the universal moral values found across all religions. However, when you're managing the sheer diversity we see here, it requires an incredibly delicate political balance to ensure no single group ends up dominating the others. The real trouble starts when religion is viewed as the exclusive basis of the nation. We call this communalism. It's basically the fundamentally flawed belief that people of a particular religion share identical fundamental interests and that they just can't live as equal citizens with followers of other religions. In everyday life, this manifests as religious prejudices and stereotypes. In politics, it becomes a dangerous quest for majoritarian dominance. And in its absolute ugliest form, communalism leads to devastating violence and riots.
To defend against exactly that, the makers of India's constitution were hyper-aware of the threat of communal politics, the fear that state power might be used to prop up one religious group over another. So they actively embedded the model of a secular state directly into the constitution. This means there is literally no official religion for the state, unlike, say, Islam in Pakistan or Buddhism in Sri Lanka. A secular constitution guarantees you the freedom to practice any religion you want, or none at all, and completely prohibits discrimination based on faith. It's the essential bedrock needed to counter the divisive nature of communalism.
Let's move on to Section 4, Caste, Hierarchy and Politics. We've explored gender and religion, but the caste division is uniquely and deeply entrenched in Indian society. You know, all societies have some kind of division of labor, for sure, but the caste system is this extreme ladder-like hierarchy. It was built on a hereditary occupational division, totally sanctioned by rituals. It mandated that you had to marry within your caste, and it was brutally enforced by excluding so-called outcast groups, subjecting them to the horrific practice of untouchability. Today, thankfully, social reformers, economic development, urbanization, and strict constitutional rules have severely weakened those old notions of caste hierarchy. But let's be real, they haven't disappeared completely. Even today, the effects of centuries of accumulated advantages and disadvantages are very, very real. The numbers speak for themselves here. Looking at data from the National Sample Survey, you can clearly see how heavily caste is still tied to economic status. Just look at the proportion of folks living below the poverty line. It's merely 46% for scheduled tribes and almost 36% for scheduled castes in rural areas. Meanwhile, for Hindu upper castes, that number drops all the way down to less than 12%. It's a stark reminder that access to education and resources in the past directly dictates economic security today. Because of this harsh economic reality, caste inevitably spills over into politics. But it's totally a two-way street. It's not just politics getting caste-ridden. It is caste getting politicized. Caste groups try to expand their influence by bringing in neighboring subcastes, and they form coalitions to negotiate for power. But keep this in mind. The idea of a completely unified caste vote bank, that's mostly a myth. No single parliamentary constituency has a clear majority of just one caste, and rich and poor members of the exact same caste often vote very differently. At the end of the day, voters care deeply about economic conditions and how the government is actually performing, not just about identity. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, the double-edged sword of identity politics. We've seen throughout this explainer how bringing social divisions into the political arena can be incredibly empowering. It gives disadvantaged communities, whether that's women fighting an invisible divide or lower castes demanding their fair share, the actual space to demand power and dignity. But exclusive, laser-focused attention to identity, like we saw with religious communalism, can spark deep division, distract us from pressing issues like poverty, and even lead to real violence.
So the health of any democracy really relies on navigating this exact tension. I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. If our social identities, our gender, our religion, our caste, inevitably shape our personal and economic lives, shouldn't they also shape our politics to help create a truly equal democracy? Or does focusing so heavily on what makes us different prevent us from finding the common ground we actually need to move forward together? It's a delicate balance for sure, and one we are constantly trying to refine. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the world around you.